how often and how egregiously does it vary? Does the reality of a set of risks vary with the narrative that we are being told in the press?
The two are completely divorced from each other.
Right.
There is no connection between the two. Take Iraq as an example. There are areas of Iraq that are actually quite safe for doing business from a physical perspective. From a political perspective, getting enmeshed with the Iraqi government is its own set of nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
But from a physical perspective, there are areas in Iraq where the security risks are really not that high. There are other regions of Iraq where really you don't want to touch it with a 12-foot barge pole. So it's about being able to speak to people at the right level of Zoom. The narrower it gets, the more you can give them details on specifically this location and this asset. What are the risks? What are the problems that they're facing, and how does it affect them? And then you can speak to them at a country level, and then you can speak to them at a regional level. What are the different factors in Iraq? Which part of Iraq are the Turks trying to take? Which parts of Iraq will the Iranians never compromise about? Where do the Americans fit into that picture? And what about the Chinese and Russian assets? What are the risks to them? So it's about being able to get specific on the locations that the client is interested in. And it's about being able to understand the big picture and tell them how this is likely to change.
I see. So this makes a lot of sense. So if I'm an oil company and I'm thinking about investing in a relatively safe bit of Iraq, my return profile on the investment needs to be more or less normal. Whereas if it's in a disputed bit, the return needs to be significantly higher to justify the risk. That's kind of the way they think about it.
That's part of it. Although that then goes into the way the Iraqis do oil contracts, which is different from most.
Right.
So
yes,
the political aspect of it and the security aspect of it are two different conversations completely. And both affect the commercial outcome.
Okay, and the thing that I'm intrigued about here now is, so you provide this real analysis to corporations.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, right, the political narrative that goes around, which you say is completely divorced from reality, it appears that the politicians actually believe it, but they actually smoke their own ganja. So when you're presenting this stuff to the C-suite of various corporations, are they sufficiently able to detach themselves from the narrative that they're getting every time they go home and turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper to the reports that you're giving them? Are they able to distinguish in their mind quite clearly the two?
Most of them are. I mean, it's something that you acquire over time. I think in many instances, the politicians really stopped believing that they could make Iraq into a democracy. And there was acceptance that this is a competition with the Iranians over who gets what within Iraq.
Is it possible I'm being unfair to the politicians? Is it possible that they?
I think the
more
more
they know
senior
that everything
they
coming
are,
out their mouth is rubbish, but they're just putting on a show.
There is an element of that. I mean, we don't know how much Tony Blair and co. knew about the Iraq war and about the weapons of mass destruction. Mm-hmm. We don't know how much they genuinely believed and how much they genuinely lied. There is an element of them believing their own shtick. I find that the local level personnel tend to have a good detailed knowledge of the ground, but even with them, you find a degree of idealism that is quite divorced from reality. So you will find embassy staff who are genuinely committed to democratizing Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or what have you, with that having no relevance to what actually goes on the ground and how the country works. You also find them having very intimate knowledge of the various players and their loyalties. And one wonders at how much is there of cognitive dissonance and how much are they just deceiving themselves and lying outright to them, to their audiences.
Okay, so I can understand that the public needs to be sold a narrative. I get that. And it's probably, if you're sending troops over there, it's probably quite helpful if they fully believe it as well, because it's much more convincing to send a young man out to fight for democracy than it is for We want oil contracts or whatever it is, or we're
Yes.
in a geopolitical game with Iran, or whatever the actual reality underground is.
Yes.
And I can suppose you can excuse it in embassy staff and so on, as long as they can do the dual trick in your mind that they're talking about, the cognitive dissonance, and actually get the point job done. But it starts to get extremely dangerous the higher up the chain you go, if people actually believe the propaganda version of why something is being done as opposed to the real version. Is that something you see a lot?
It's most dangerous in the context of Russia and China, where you have senior politicians saying that the borders of Ukraine are inviolable, whereas they leave their own borders open. So it's not
Yes.
a question of the
Yes.
viability of borders. There, it is clearly a question of imperial competition, which is fair. I don't object to empires. They're just part of nature. They're part of how we organize them ourselves. However, sometimes you need to be a little bit humble and accept that certain geopolitical problems like France or Russia are not going away, and that this is something that you have to live with and manage as opposed to solve.
Mm.
The problem is that in a democracy, telling people that the Russians are a problem that we have to manage doesn't really appeal to people. Whereas telling them either that the Russians are wonderful and we get along extremely well with them, or that the Russians are all evil and they must be destroyed and stopped, that actually appeals to people emotionally. A big
Yes.
part of the problem that you're trying to put your finger on is that democracy is a highly emotional game. You really want to be extremely cold when you're thinking about strategy and politics. And getting emotion involved is inherently destructive. This is why the game of politics was always an elite game. With democracy, it's been transformed into a spectator sport. The two don't go well together.
That is a good point. That is a good point. Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny. I mean, on Russia, if you look back to, say, the Second World War, we needed Russia, and therefore Stalin was good old Uncle Joe. And he was built up as this sort of friendly, sort of uncle-like character. And then the moment we decided we wanted to turn against him, it flips the other way. And the public seem to have no problem with this. The public can be moved around quite significantly. And we're obviously in a period at the moment where Russians are villain. I mean, I remember when this Ukraine war started, you had people who were like, I think there was one Russian cellist or something that got thrown out of her apartment in a university simply on the grounds that she was Russian.
Yes.
I had this as well. I mean, I remember when the war started, a mate of mine, we got this group chat, and he was genuinely angry. It's like, what the hell are you angry about? A border dispute. But he had been whipped up into that by the media. So
Yes. Yes.
So I'm just a bit confused with the whole Russian thing, because it doesn't appear to concern. Well, it doesn't concern me as a British. I don't get what the British concern is here.
Look, a lot of the British leadership is still in the mindset where they think that they're still playing the great game. And they're under the illusion that one day the Russians are going to get to the Gulf and get to India, and this is going to mean that the British Empire is defeated.
Yes.
Absent from their minds is the reality that the British Empire has been utterly destroyed, that Britain herself is being ravaged, that they have no geopolitical relevance. They tried to send one of the two aircraft carriers that they had to do something about the Houthi in Yemen, and they were unable to send the ship. They were unable to do anything. It didn't work. The ship, the carriers that they paid for didn't actually work. So they're under the illusion that they're still in this competition, and they don't notice that now India is a completely autonomous player that's more focused on its own role containing China in partnership with Russia than it is on what the British want. Okay. So they suffer from this delusion of grandeur, and they believe that their role in the world is global and important, when in reality, to the extent that their role is global, it is as a cautionary tale.
Yes. Yes, I had wondered that, because obviously the great game of the 1800s, where the British Empire tried to contain the various powers to the east, particularly Russia, keep Germany apart from Russia.
Before agreeing to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which,
Yes.
if implemented in full, would have given the Russians Constantinople and the Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits, giving it access to the Mediterranean Sea and solving the perennial Russian problem of frozen ports.
Oh, so we must come back to that, the Russian long game. But yes, so the great game played out for a long time, and Britain was good at it.
Yes.
And I mean, it had a lot of resources and empire and so on. As you say, this has been gradually, and this for me has been the. So I'm glad you're saying it. The best explanation I can come up with for the severe Russophobia that this country seems to have. It's that it made sense 150, 200 years ago, and that has passed down like a genetic memory through the organisations, despite the fact that everything else has changed.
100% true. I would add to that a couple of things. If these people were forced to acknowledge geopolitical reality, they'd have to look at Britain in her current state. If they did that, the only honorable option for them to take would be to go behind the shed with a revolver.
Yes.
And end
That'd be
it.
nice, wouldn't it?
So what this belligerence towards Russia allows them to do is to create a highly emotional narrative, which is always necessary in a democratic context, and use it as a distraction. The problem that they're facing is that things have gotten so bad that this kind of petty distraction is an irrelevance. So they will yell at Farage or at whoever that, no, you're a Putin shill, you're a Russian agent, whatever it is. Mainly to distract from the fact that they have categorically failed in doing anything that would allow Britain to have genuine geopolitical influence. So it's not just the
Yes.
memory, it's also the smokescreen. Who cares if
Yes.
the Russians of Odessa or Kharkiv or even Kiev are under Russian rule or under Ukrainian rule? How does this matter? Whereas the price of your house, the degraded services, the problem with migration, the problem with multiculturalism,
stuff, yeah.
the safety of your family, these are of immediate concern. But if you speak to them, if you were to speak about these issues in the same emotional language that they use about Putin,
Yes.
the reaction from the public would be severe because they would understand the extent of the betrayal. So it's important for British leaders to stay stuck on this narrative because the alternative narratives are horrific. Now, for the Europeans, it varies a little bit. For the Poles, there is an immediate threat. If Ukraine collapses, then there is a real risk that the Baltic states would be next, and then the Poles would be on the border with Russia, and that would mean that they have to spend massive amounts on their military, and that would mean that they're vulnerable to the same problem that the Poles have always had, which is simultaneous pressure from the Germans and from the Russians. So I understand Poland's position. I understand Germany's position a lot less. Germany prospers when there's cheap Russian energy and cheap Russian natural resources.
Yes.
Except that the current German leadership is fully bought into the cult of wokeness with everything that entails. From green energy to collective guilt of the Germans replacing original sin, to the whole mess around sexuality and transgenderism, basically making gender identity into a substitute for having a soul. You have something within you that is eternal, that is not seen, that is different from your physical being, except that it's not a soul from God, it's just gender identity. You know? They have their eschatology around climate change, and they're fully bought into that cult. Putin is, in a sense, the antithesis of that. He loves Russia and he says so. He prays in a church, whether or not he believes is a different matter, but he prays in a church.
Yeah, he makes sure that he's seen doing so.
He makes sure that he's seen doing so. He's proud of Russian history. He's genuinely attached to Russian symbols and wants the public to be attached to them. He's not on board with the gender insanity. And he's obviously not on board with green energy, given Russia's location. You can't really build solar farms in Russia. That would be stupid. And you can't build wind farms because they'd freeze. And given Russian exports. So in a sense, he is the perfect demon for them because he is
Well, he's everything they're not.
Exactly. He's the antithesis of the woke religion that they've adopted. Now, perhaps a more sane perspective would say, these are ethnically similar fellow Christian nations. Maybe we can cooperate with them because there's a much bigger economic threat and political threat that's coming from China.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.